Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization at the IISS. In today's episode, we'll discuss the key themes from the 17th IISS Manama Dialogue, which was held in Bahrain from the 19th to the 21st of November 2021. The dialogue is an annual international security and regional diplomatic summit held in Bahrain that brings together high-level representation from governments and stakeholders from across the Middle East and beyond. This year's event covered key regional security developments ranging from questions about the US's security commitment to the region, the growing relationship between the Gulf and Asia, the cautious optimism around de-escalation efforts, the potential role of minilateral diplomacy in the region, and a renewed focus on the Red Sea as a geopolitical arena with its own unique dynamics. Before we look to the 18th IISS Manama Dialogue to be held from the 18th to the 20th of November 2022, we have three distinguished IISS experts with us today to discuss the reflections of this year's event: Sir Tom Beckett, Dr. Hasan Hasan, and Camille. Sir Tom Beckett is Executive Director of the IISS Middle East Office, where he plays a leading role in organizing the annual IISS Manama Dialogue and the Dialogue Sherpa meeting. Dr. Hasan Hasan is IISS Research Fellow for Middle East Policy, based in Bahrain, where he researches South Asian Middle Eastern relations, as well as the foreign policies and economic statecraft of Gulf states and regional security. Camille is IISS Research Associate, based in Bahrain, where she focuses her research on political and security developments in the Gulf region, with a specific focus on Gulf countries' economic and political relations with Asian powers and the Horn of Africa. Well, Tom, Camille, and Hasan, welcome onto the show. Tom, let's start with you. Could you please give us an impression of this year's Manama Dialogue?
Yes, of course. From my perspective, it was probably one of the strongest in substance dialogues that I've had the pleasure of being at, four as a delegate and four in this role as the Executive Director of the Middle East Office. Last year, because we were at the height of the COVID pandemic and before any vaccination programs had rolled out, we only managed to have a small number of delegates, 92 in total, supported by about 200 plus officials. This year, because of the vaccination program and because of Bahrain's exemplary COVID precautionary measures, we managed to have a total of 356 delegates on site, and we issued a total of 2,100 badges for both supporting staff, but also security and some of the hotel staff as well. And why was it so good? I think that there was a desire for people to get out and see each other at senior level, to take part in both in the discussion that we always generate, but also to have the range of bilateral meetings. I thought it was significant that Brett McGurk in his plenary, when he was speaking, said that he had managed to compress 9 months of work into a weekend because of the range of people he saw. If I just give you a quick snapshot, we had, as I said, 356 delegates from 34 countries. There were at least 63 bilaterals that we know of, and they are only the ones that we help arrange. 30 government delegations, 16 ministers, 9 of which were at cabinet level, 3 chiefs of defense, and interestingly this year, 11 chiefs of intelligence or vice chiefs of intelligence. So it was a significant gathering. I think what was said on the stage was important. I think the challenge that came from the floor was equally important. And I think the presence of so many senior people contributed to bilateral discussions that hopefully will have gone some way to fulfill what is the IISS's core role, which is to promote international peace and security.
Fantastic. So, Tom, a major theme at this year's Manama Dialogue was undeniably the U.S. commitment to the region following its withdrawal from Afghanistan and continued prioritization by the United States of the Indo-Pacific theater. Do you think that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin succeeded in reassuring countries in the region that they were part of an unmatched, unrivaled, and unparalleled network of allies and partners, as he put it?
Well, he certainly tried, but whether he actually succeeded or not is another matter. His message was clear enough, and I'll come back to that. But I think what he did when he said, or how the US relies on its network within the region, I think it was a poor example to use Afghanistan, because whilst tactically and logistically it was very impressive to get non-combatant evacuation of whatever it was, 124,000 people from Afghanistan, the earlier impression and the lasting impression in the region, quite widely held, is that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a NATO and predominantly a US failure. Using that as an example of good networks probably wasn't that wise. But he did make the point that they would favor diplomacy in their relations with Iran, but they would not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Brett McGurk, in the concluding plenary, and whether this is because it was felt that there wasn't enough emphasis in Secretary Austin's statement, underlined quite a few of the topics that underlined some of the themes that Secretary Austin had used. Bookending the dialogue in that way did provide a level of emphasis on what the US is prepared to do. Whether it fell on deaf ears or not is another matter. I think, and we heard it in the region, I'm sure Hasan will probably come back to it, a lot of regional governments are still hedging. Name another country that is willing to do what the US is willing to do, even if it withdraws capability. Neither Russia nor China will invest in the security of this side of the Gulf against the other side of the Gulf. And of course, the three of us are, Hasan, Camille, and I are sitting here in the Manama office on the western side of the Gulf. It's just wholly, to my mind, implausible that either Russia or China, with their clear stances on Iran and partnerships in some areas, difficult partnerships clearly, but Russia's in Syria and China's through procurement of oil and so on, that they're going to take such a hardline stance as the US might.
We'll come to both the JCPOA as well as the issue of Russia and China later in the show. But touching quickly on Israel and Palestine, at last year's Manama Dialogue, then Israeli Foreign Minister Ashkenazi said that the diplomatic shift following the Abraham Accords that the UAE and Bahrain had struck with Israel could help resolve the Palestine-Israeli conflict. How did Palestine feature in this year's Manama Dialogue, and was there a sense of progress, do you think?
No, not particularly, and I'm not really surprised. There's been 70 years of hostility between the Arab nations and Israel. So I think 1 year of the Abraham Accords that only includes 4 countries, notwithstanding the fact that Egypt and Jordan already have peace deals with Israel. It's not surprising that 1 year is not going to make a huge difference. I think for me, what's difficult to comprehend is how the countries in the Abraham Accords are going to press Israel to commit to a two-state solution. All the other Arab countries, and indeed majority Muslim countries, will say that the two-state solution is the only option, and yet there doesn't seem to be any idea of how Israel is going to be compelled, coerced, cajoled, convinced to go into to re-adopt a two-state solution. I did think it was interesting, however, when Prince Turki Al Faisal asked the Israeli NSA Halata a question about effectively saying that the Palestinian problem is the root cause of all problems in the Gulf. I thought NSA Halata was very quick in his response when he said, "And are you really telling me that when Iran attacked Abqaiq and the Aramco facility there, that was our fault?" Prince Turki was nodding when Halat asked that question. But again, I'm not so sure attacking Aramco from Iran is anything to do with Israel. But I don't see how they're going to square the circle. I think it's going to be harder now. Not harder. It's going to be achieving a two-state solution through pressure from the Abraham Accords nations seems difficult.
And overall, would you say that there was a sense of optimism or pessimism from regional leaders and experts at the Manama Dialogue this year?
There's certainly evidence around the Manama Dialogue of de-escalation. Yesterday, you had His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed visiting Ankara to see President Erdogan. Whether there's policy to underpin that de-escalation that can go into the long term, or whether it's just policy by statements and sound bites is another matter. Statement, sound bites, and movement to capitals and talking to capitals. There seemed to be a degree of optimism, but I'm not sure what it was founded on.
Hasan, let's talk about that regional de-escalation. Did you get a sense that this will be long lasting, and could you perhaps talk a little bit about the drivers and its limitations?
There is a pronounced trend towards de-escalation, but I think we need to recognize that it's a fairly vulnerable one, and one that is open to being spoiled by a number of actors that don't necessarily have an interest in seeing it materialize or deepen even further. And so I think, yes, a strong and pronounced trend towards de-escalation, the Al Ula summit, where the Gulf Rift between the Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt on the one hand, and Qatar on the other hand, was resolved. Is obviously a case in point. Another is the de-escalatory trend in Turkey's relations with the Arab Gulf states, and we've recently seen Emirati Crown Prince, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, visit Ankara in what is really a fairly substantial shift in Turkey-Emirati relations. And of course, we're seeing the regional diplomatic track between Saudi Arabia and Iran as another avenue of de-escalation, so to speak. And so, yes, there is a region-wide trend towards de-escalation. But as I said, there are a number of actors that don't necessarily have an interest in seeing regional de-escalation. So, for example, Iran's non-state partners and proxy groups and militias in Yemen, for example, the Houthis or the Ansarullah movement, clearly don't have an interest in seeing the Saudis and the Iranians agree a deal over their heads, so to speak, in Yemen. A deal that could lead to limiting or curtailing Iran's support for the Houthi movement in Yemen. Iran's non-state partners in Iraq are other actors that could end up spoiling Saudi-Iranian de-escalation as well. Some of these de-escalatory processes, such as the Al-Ula, haven't necessarily resolved the underlying fundamental issues. So, for example, Bahraini-Qatari relations are still not back to normal. There still is an absence of formal diplomatic ties, and tensions continue to simmer under the surface. And I think, ironically as well, the nuclear talks and the uncertain outlook of Iran's nuclear program, and whether Iran and the P5+1 reach a deal by the end of the year, is something that could also end up spoiling or undermining regional de-escalation. Because if there ends up being a failure to reach a diplomatic agreement on Iran's nuclear program, then we could very well see a rise in tensions. We could see unilateral action that could lead to an escalatory spiral, and that will definitely have an adverse effect on regional de-escalation. So yes, there is a tendency towards and a trend towards regional de-escalation, but as I said, there are a number of spoilers and factors that could undermine the process.
Well, let's talk about Iran now then. In his speech, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin stated that the US remained committed to preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon and committed to a diplomatic outcome of the nuclear issue. However, he also stated that if Iran wasn't willing to engage seriously, then the US will look at all options necessary to keep the US secure. So, Hasan, what's the view in the region of the JCPOA in Iran at the moment? What are the priorities and concerns of countries like Israel or Gulf states?
I think the US was very clear, be it through the speech of Secretary Austin or Brett McGurk, or even the side briefing by the US Special Envoy on Iran, Rob Malley, during the Manama Dialogue. The US's talking points and position on Iran's nuclear program and what it is willing and not willing to tolerate, I think was absolutely clear. The Americans were also emphatic as to the fact that they were willing to do all that is necessary to prevent Iran from being a nuclear weapon. But the issue from the regional perspective, from the perspective of the US's traditional security partners in the Gulf, the Arab Gulf states, is that really they're between a rock and a hard place. So on the one hand, if the talks end up failing and we don't get a diplomatic agreement on Iran's nuclear program, then the probability or likelihood of regional escalation and even perhaps military action becomes much higher. And that will obviously have a massively detrimental effect on their own security. I think the last thing the Arab Gulf states want to see is a regional war in which they get dragged in, because obviously they host US forces and troops, and so will inevitably be dragged into the fray. On the other hand, if Iran and the P5+1 do agree on and do end up reaching a deal that places limits on Iran's nuclear program, then the Arab Gulf states suspect that this will be sort of an off ramp for the US to disengage strategically from the region even further. And the US will very much use a new nuclear deal with Iran as an excuse not to engage Iran on other topics, such as Iran's support for militias or Iran's proliferation of missiles or its use of short-range missile capabilities. So, in a sense, it's a bit of a lose-lose situation from the Arab Gulf perspective. The main ask and the main expectation on the Arab Gulf side has been to ask for greater clarity in terms of what US policy on Iran's non nuclear related foreign policy aspects of its behavior are. And so, what is the US policy on countering Iran's use and proliferation of missiles? What is the US willing to do to curtail Iran's support of non state actors? I think these are all issues that are really at the top of the priority list of the Arab Gulf states. And I think, at least according to the conversations that I've been having over the past few days, and certainly during the Manama Dialogue, that there was a lack of US clarity as to where it stood on all of these non nuclear related issues.
Thank you. Maybe moving on to Camille. The Red Sea has seemingly reemerged as an arena of competition and geopolitical importance. How was this reflected at the Manama Dialogue this year?
Thanks, Meia. So yes, indeed, there was a very interesting session this year that touched on Red Sea dynamics. We had the Kenyan Secretary of Defense, the Yemeni Foreign Minister. We had also the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. I think there is a growing acknowledgement of the Red Sea as a region that has a geopolitical region with dynamics of its own. Because for a long time, it's been perceived as being a sort of border region between more important geopolitical complexes. And we've seen over the past maybe 10 years, international observers and policymakers that are increasingly looking at how the Red Sea is becoming a geopolitical region with dynamics of its own. We see, and this is something that the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa was pointing in her speech, the interconnected nature of conflicts and security dynamics across both shores of the Red Sea. It's a region that has long been very important for the international community because it's a major maritime trade choke point. It's bordered by a number of unstable countries, either in conflicts or with going through difficult political transitions. But what we're increasingly seeing is the entanglement of the conflict dynamics or of political dynamics across both shores of the Red Sea, either through spillover of conflicts, terrorism, piracy, refugee flows, arms smuggling as well between countries like Yemen and the Horn of Africa, but also through the projection of external influence, especially from other countries like Gulf states that have increasingly tried to shape political dynamics in their Western strategic flank and projecting their own sometimes internal divisions on the Horn of Africa. A third layer as well that both the EU Special Representative and the Kenyan Secretary of Defense underlined was the increasing presence of external powers as well, including China, Russia, and how this is reviving a bit the specter of great power competition potentially. And the Kenyan Secretary of Defense highlighted the militarization of the region and the potential destabilizing effects this could have as well. So what is interesting is to see how the Red Sea fits into those wider security complexes, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, but also the wider East-West axis of the Indo-Pacific, and how this creates a continuity between these different geopolitical theaters.
Camille and Hasan, how is great power competition reverberating in the Gulf then? And in particular, do you see US policy shaping Russian and Chinese behavior in the region?
what we have seen on the Gulf side in recent years is a growing effort to diversify their relations away from their traditional Western partners at a moment when, and Tom was already alluding to that, but at a moment when these countries fear that the US is trying to lessen its commitment to the region. I think what was very interesting in this Manama Dialogue this year is that the Chinese were not present, and so we had discussions although China was a bit the elephant in the room, but the discussions were quite centered also on the Malaysian defense minister, the Indonesian defense minister, and so I think that is interesting because it shifts the focus. We tend to have a myopic focus a little bit at the moment on the US-China rivalry, and so how the Gulf fits into this. And it actually shows how this is not just about China from the Gulf perspective, but it's about how they are diversifying their ties with a wide range of partners in Asia as well, and Southeast Asia, but also with India, Japan, Korea. And this is part of a broader effort of Gulf states to diversify their ties in a wide range of sectors, economic sectors, in energy, but also in new technologies, and potentially also in security ties. And so it was interesting also to take that question of the relationship between Asia and the Gulf out of only this bipolar division between China and the US.
That's right. There is diversification, but I am going to press you on the issue of Russia and China to ask where countries in the region align with both of these actors and where they might not align with both of these actors, and what that means for their ability to balance their relationship with the United States, and whether or not this creates dilemmas for regional countries, particularly in the Gulf.
Two recent events or recent occurrences. One, the US, I guess it was probably a démarche of some description on the Emirates about the potential Chinese base and what that might mean for F-35 deals and so on and so forth, but certainly an expression of displeasure that they might have a presence in the Emirates. And we'd previously, in years past, seen that the same thing had happened in Oman at Meia Nouwens, where there was an idea that the Chinese would establish a base there, and the Omanis, in a much more gracious way, were persuaded out of that by the Americans. But also, just before the dialogue, we saw that in an almost wholly dismissive way, Saudi said, we're not buying S-400. So after having had, sort of had all these meetings and trips to Russia and so on and so forth, and signing, pacts and so on, then it's just sort of, yeah, we're not going to buy it. So I think whilst there is a desire to diversify in the security space, it may be less so about platforms. I think sort of the idea that you could replace your military hardware with Russian hardware or Chinese hardware over anything less than a 25-year period is just wholly impractical, if nothing else, because of the manpower that needs to be trained to operate that equipment. So I think that is realized. I also think that it's interesting that that Russia has always tried to. Russia and Iran periodically float this idea of an equivalent thing of an OSCE in the Gulf, so that it can get rid of foreign powers and the Gulf can look after itself. And of course, that's all part of the piece of get rid of America out of the Gulf. So, in many ways, Iran and Iran's problem for the Gulf is a boon for Russia, because it's a continual and perpetual nuisance. And they can be a nuisance however they want it to be. So, and it's pretty light cost nuisance. For China, there's other motivations, and Camille is far more qualified than me to talk about those.
I would say to come back on the relationship with China, this is a relationship with the Gulf that has been developing quite rapidly over the past 2 decades. Originally mainly in the energy sector, and it's still the big pillar of that relationship. And in recent years, it has diversified as well towards new areas of partnership, including in new technologies and health cooperation we've seen during the COVID pandemic, political, and even to some extent a bit of security relations as well. And of course, investment in the field of infrastructures within the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. The area where we've seen increasing frictions with the US on this front in recent years was the field of new technologies, and especially the question of 5G networks, where Huawei has been present pretty much in all GCC countries to help them develop their 5G infrastructures. And this has raised some concerns in the US in terms of the type of vulnerabilities this could create for US interest, especially to these countries where the US is exporting sensitive military technologies and cooperating in the defense sector, especially in the UAE, where at the moment they are discussing with the US the idea of potentially acquiring the F-35. And so this question of 5G, but also cooperation in new emerging technology, especially AI, that can have potential security ramifications. This has created some frictions with the US that has trying to pressure these countries to be careful on not crossing any red lines with the Chinese on these specific sectors that could be sensitive at some point. The problem is that the US has not been always very good at setting their red lines or very clear with these countries. And so for now, for example, all of them have moved forward with Huawei, for example, in their 5G infrastructures. And so this is one point of important friction that we're seeing in the region at the moment.
And I suppose it doesn't help that they might be looking at countries like the Republic of Korea, whereby they've created a bubble of telecommunications infrastructure around defense installations with the United States to segment off that particular part of their network. That might then, for them, be an example of how to move forward without ripping Huawei out of their networks entirely. Maybe moving on to my last question, Hasan, considering the concerns that we've talked about from the region's perspective in today's podcast and the general sense of doubt about the US commitment in the region, are we seeing new groupings form regionally to address some of these concerns? And I point here particular to new partnerships and minilaterals.
That's a really interesting, I think, one, and it really ties back into the preceding discussion because the underlying theme here is the Gulf and the Arab states or the Middle Eastern states' relations with external partners. Partly what's going on is that I like to take the longer historical view on this, and I think there's been a long pattern of diversification of external relations away from traditional Western-centric security partnerships. So this is something I think that proceeded in earnest since the early 2000s, following the 9/11 attacks, very largely, where we've seen a real interest on the part of the Arab Gulf states, for example, in cultivating a broader range of relationships outside of the Western sphere, but also outside of their own neighborhoods. And so we've seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others reach out to China and India and other Asian players. I think acceleration of the US-China rivalry has been a problematic development for these states, especially as the US becomes more demanding as to how these players can, and in what sectors these players can or cannot cooperate with the Chinese. You're right in pointing to the proliferation of so-called minilateral initiatives. So one of them, for example, in the Eastern Mediterranean is the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which is clearly oriented against Turkey. The Abraham Accords, which seem to have at least partly Iran in sight. The so-called Middle Eastern Quartet or West Asian Quad, which comprises India, the US, Israel, and the UAE, and a number of others that are really being announced and disbanded almost week in, week out. The issue is that there isn't necessarily always an overriding or a clear geopolitical orientation or a clear geopolitical logic that neatly organizes all of these groups or all of these alignments. So it's really a mishmash of overlapping alignments and partnerships that are being created. So take and there are multiple examples to allude to this, right? And so on the one hand, look at India's involvement in the region, right? India is part of this Middle Eastern Quad that comprises Israel, the UAE, the US, countries that seem to that have to a very large extent difficult relations with Iran. And I think part of the reason, and this is part of the difficulty for India, because on the other hand, India has very good relations with Iran. It sees Iran as a difficult partner nonetheless, but still a partner that is very important in its own connectivity towards Afghanistan and towards the Central Asian republics. And so I don't think there are clear region-wide, let's say, geopolitical alignments. It's more about, it really looks like a dizzying, complex mishmash and overlapping networks of partnerships that are being created. And sometimes, ironically, different members of these different minilateral initiatives have very different ideas as to what these initiatives and partnerships and groups are actually about, and who they're meant to counter, and so on. And so there are no neat geopolitical logics at play here.
With Hasan's part, and he was talking about the Eastern Med piece, and I just thought we invited, for the first time, we had the Greek foreign minister speaking at the Manama Dialogue, and he spoke excellently and really charismatically. What I thought was interesting, notwithstanding the Eastern Med piece, and also the France-Greece agreement that was recently signed, but was the level of engagement that Greece was conducting down into the Arabian Peninsula. And I wondered, was that a bit of to try and sort of encircle the Turkish engagement that's already down to certain parts of the peninsula? And I just wondered when he was standing up there and talking about what might be heralded for Greece in the future, where else they might go. But I just thought it was an interesting dimension that I hadn't seen coming.
We're running out of time, so I wanted to ask each of you what your final key takeaway was from the dialogue this year that you think our listeners should keep an eye on.
2019, the Americans under the Trump administration recognized Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights. And when quizzed on it, despite all of the UN resolutions that say that they shouldn't, Secretary Pompeo said we've just got to accept the facts on the ground. And we see a lot of accepting of the facts on the ground now, with Emirati outreach to Assad, with King Hussein of Jordan, with Assad, and so on and so forth. And although it wasn't, it was slightly discounted. The discussions about whether Syria will be brought back into the Arab League. Just accepting the facts on the ground there. The chief of staff of Yemen was very clear that for him there was no political solution with the Houthi, even if the foreign minister said that there was, but he reckoned that there wasn't. So it may be that there'll have to be some sort of accepting of the facts on the ground. Now, the facts on the ground in Yemen are that the Houthi are in control. So that'll be a difficult one for them to square. And then the last one, I guess, and just stepping slightly out of the actual Middle East and into Afghanistan, is that, and it was said previously, and I thought it was a really interesting point, is that despite everyone's concern about the Taliban takeover in Kabul, because of the security threats and the potential, the growing humanitarian problem inside Afghanistan, as someone said, it is in all of our interest for the Taliban to succeed. So another accepting of the facts on the ground. And I wonder whether this just continues to undermine the rules-based order that we all would hope would govern international relations, but which also is not always the most popular, and certainly in this part of the world. Who wrote the rules and for who, and why should we be governed by them?
Another issue that came up during the discussions over the 2 days of the Manama Dialogue was the question of the security dividends of the Abraham Accords. And to what extent can Israel cooperate in the security sphere with the Arab Gulf states? I think one issue on which the Israelis have been rather non-committal is the question of whether Israel is willing or prepared to share or sell missile defense technology to their Abraham Accords partners. There were also a few rumors launched, I think 1 day before the dialogue, that Israel was joining the combined maritime forces that are stationed and headquartered out of Bahrain. I think that seems highly unlikely to happen because there are a number of members of the combined maritime forces that don't necessarily approve of Israel's joining the CMF. Kuwait is probably one of them. Pakistan may be another. But we're seeing a testing of the boundaries, so to speak, and so. Absolutely. I mean, we're also seeing on the one hand Israel conducting joint naval exercises with the United States, with the UAE, with Bahrain and the Red Sea, and so on the one hand, there is a clear desire to partner with Israel in the security and military sphere. And so these exercises, naval exercises in the Red Sea, are one example of that. But on the other hand, there are clear limitations as to what Israel can do, because I think an Israeli military presence in the Gulf is likely to send a strong message to Iran, and Iran is likely to see it as being a hostile message. And I think, especially in multilateral security initiatives such as the Combined Maritime Forces, we're likely to see a fair degree of apprehension from other regional players that might not necessarily be as comfortable as the UAE or Bahrain in seeing a stronger Israeli security presence here.
For me, the most interesting part of this Manama dialogue was how it puts the Middle East in the wider context, regionally speaking. When we look at, there was the Red Sea panel with the Kenyan defense minister, there was the opening address was made by the Indonesian defense minister, or the Malaysian on the panel on Gulf Asia. And I think this is, for me, the thing that I retain the most from this Manama dialogue is how the Gulf is increasingly seeing itself in this wider regional context that is no longer only focused, the discussion is no longer only focused on this relationship with Western powers or with the US. And during the Young Leaders program as well that we had just before the Manama dialogue, it was something as well that was very present in the discussions. We had very good presentations from our young leaders on Gulf Asia relations. And so I think that we're seeing a new generation as well in the Gulf that is increasingly looking at those relations with Asia, with Africa, etc., and no longer only considering themselves in the Gulf Western angle.
Well, Tom, Camille, and Hasan, congratulations on a fascinating and successful Manama Dialogue 2021. Thank you for joining me on the show today. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to watch the recordings of the plenary sessions and find out more about the key takeaways, visit our website on www.iiss.org. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. And for more in-depth analysis of the key international security and defense issues from around the world, be sure to follow the IISS on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you, and see you next time.